Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Rushell, and I'm with the Global CCS Institute's team in the Americas region. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on options for incentivizing large-scale CCS projects in budget-constrained times. I'll be the moderator for the webinar. CCS stakeholders understand that more large-scale projects are needed to advance CCS in time for wide-scale deployment. However, high capture costs coupled with a lack of incentives are keeping new large-scale projects from entering the planning pipeline and making it difficult for some existing projects to make investment decisions. Joining me today to discuss ideas for increasing the number of projects through incentives tied to the use of capture of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery are representatives of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES, and the Coal Utilization Research Council, CURC. We have a slight programming change today. Due to unexpected circumstances, Judi Greenwald from C2ES will not be presenting today. Substituting for Judi will be Patrick Falwell. Patrick is a Solutions Fellow for C2ES, where he analyzes clean energy and climate change policy at the state and federal level. Patrick also monitors nationwide clean energy market developments and identifies opportunities to support clean energy growth. Patrick will be discussing the work of the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, NEORI, which was organized by C2ES and the Great Plains Institute. Joining Patrick is Ben Yamagata, the Executive Director of the Coal Utilization Research Council. Ben is also a partner in the Van Ness Feldman law firm in Washington, D.C. Ben will be discussing the concepts developed by CURC. Judi, Patrick, and Ben's full biographies are available in the webinar slides that will be posted on the Institute's website. Before I turn the webinar over to Patrick and Ben, let me say a few words about the process. Patrick and Ben will first give their presentations. We've reserved time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. During the webinar, please type your questions in English into the message box appearing on your screen. The questions will come to me and I'll present them to the speakers. I may use moderator's license and consolidate similar questions just to save time. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Institute's website in the future. With that, I'll turn the webinar over to Patrick, our first presenter.
Great, thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Falwell, and I'll be filling in for Judi today. I'm a fellow here at C2ES, or the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and I help to manage the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, or NEORI. We here at C2ES co-convene NEORI along with the Great Plains Institute of Minneapolis. Just a little bit about C2ES. We're the former Pew Center on Global Climate Change. Following the defeat of cap-and-trade legislation in the United States, C2ES decided to prioritize opportunities in the policy world where we felt there could be bipartisan support and compromise. And we felt that NEORI and CO2 EOR would be one of those issues. So moving along, here's an outline of my presentation. First, I'll go into what CO2 EOR is. I will then describe who the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative is and who are its members and why we came together. Then the majority of my presentation will focus on NEORI's consensus recommendations. NEORI's consensus recommendations call for Congress to take full advantage of CO2 EOR's potential in the United States by expanding the existing Section 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration. We believe this tax credit will increase domestic oil production, create jobs, avoid CO2 emissions, and truly drive innovation in carbon capture and storage. We believe that over time, these incentives will more than pay for themselves through new federal revenue generated by increased EOR production. And we hope this will make our proposal appealing in a time of fiscal austerity. So how does CO2 EOR, or what is CO2 EOR? CO2 EOR is tertiary oil production. It recovers additional amounts of oil from existing wells that were not recovered during initial primary and tertiary production methods. So usually you could expect the first two methods of oil production to recover about 30 to 50% of oil originally in place in a given reservoir. CO2 EOR attempts to recover an additional 15 to 30%. So how does it work? CO2 is injected underground, as you can see in the chart. It bonds with the oil in the reservoir, frees it up from rock surfaces, and this enables the oil to be able to be pumped out to the surface. The CO2 is then processed from the oil, recycled, and then re-injected for further use. Now, I should point out that each time CO2 is injected, some will remain in the well, and an EOR operator will not be able to get it back. So all CO2 that is purchased for injection will ultimately be injected into the well and stored there following the well's closure. So here's just some background on CO2 EOR. CO2 EOR has actually been around for a fair amount, 40 years approximately. It began in West Texas and has been growing slowly ever since. It's mostly a U.S. story and mostly in the Permian Basin of the United States, which is in West Texas. But opportunities have been growing in other countries as well. Overall, CO2 EOR currently accounts for about 6% of total U.S. oil production. I'd like to highlight here, though, that most CO2 EOR, around 3/4, is performed using natural CO2, which is found in geologic sources. Man-made CO2 accounts for the other quarter of CO2 EOR production, but many in the industry believe that the industry's growth is dependent on capturing more man-made CO2 for use in EOR. And here you can see a map of current CO2 EOR activity in the United States. This shows the location of existing EOR projects as well as existing CO2 capture projects and some of the natural CO2 sources as well. As you can see, most of the current EOR projects are in the Permian Basin of West Texas. Other regions have considerable EOR potential. The Rocky Mountain West, particularly in Wyoming, and in the Gulf Coast, particularly in Mississippi, is where the majority of CO2 EOR growth is outside the Permian Basin. Other regions of the United States, in particular the industrial Midwest in California, also have some CO2 EOR potential. So it is kind of a national opportunity. Moving on, why does NEORI find CO2 EOR to be so important? There are many reasons, but we believe it's an energy security, economic, and environmental solution. According to recent estimates, CO2 EOR could double the size of U.S. oil reserves, offering between 27 and 62 billion barrels of oil with existing technology. CO2 EOR can also create jobs. It is a pretty big supply chain. There's anywhere from constructing carbon capture facilities, pipelines, and EOR projects. It can raise revenues for federal and local governments from incremental EOR production, and it could potentially cut into U.S. demands for imported oil. Finally, as an environmental solution, CO2 EOR has the potential to store significant CO2 emissions. If you were to recover about 27 to 62 billion barrels of oil, you'd likely sequester 10 to 20 billion tons of CO2. CO2 EOR can also serve as a key driver for CCS. Selling captured CO2 for EOR provides a key revenue stream to help offset the high costs of investing in carbon capture. So to take advantage of CO2 EOR's potential, as I said before, we need a lot more CO2 from man-made sources. As you probably know, carbon capture has high costs, which the revenue from selling CO2 for EOR will not always overcome. And that's where NEORI comes in. And why don't you take a minute and look at this slide. This slide shows the members of the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative. We are a pretty diverse stakeholder coalition of industry, environmental groups, labor, state officials, and a couple of others. From industry, we have companies working on both carbon capture in the power sector and in the industrial sector. This group first came together in 2011, and over an 8-month period, we developed consensus recommendations for federal and state action to advance CO2 EOR in the United States. We have a 3-part agenda: recommend and advocate for incentives and other public policies to support the development of CO2 EOR in the United States, prepare key analyses to inform and support our recommendations, and finally, to increase policymaker, media, and public awareness of CO2 EOR and its opportunity. Just on the right, the Bloomberg editorial view endorsed our proposals, and they mentioned them as an energy solution during the height of the presidential election in the United States. As I mentioned, NEORI produced a consensus set of recommendations in February of 2012. Our recommendations are threefold at the federal level. Reform or make good government changes to the existing Section 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration, expand the existing Section 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration with a couple added provisions. And finally, at the state level, NEORI identified model policies which we wanted to highlight for other states to consider and how they could promote CO2 EOR. When our recommendations were released, we received a good bipartisan welcome from members of Congress in both the Senate and the House, both Democrats and Republicans. Last fall, Senators Conrad, Enzi, and Rockefeller introduced a bill that adopted our ideas for reforming the existing 45Q tax credit. Unfortunately, this bill did not survive the fiscal cliff talks, but we are now engaging the new Congress on our proposal to expand the 45Q tax credit. So now I'll get into exactly the key points and provisions of our 45Q expansion provision. The Section 45Q tax credit is a federal tax credit for carbon sequestration. It was first authorized in 2008. It provides a $10 tax credit for a ton of CO2 used in EOR and a $20 per ton of CO2 tax credit for CO2 injected into saline formations. The current program is only authorized to provide 75 million tons of CO2, and is our understanding that 22 million have already been claimed by existing projects. So there's only 50 million tons of tax credits remaining in the pool. To make up for this, NEORI recommends an expansion, both to offer more tax credits and to offer them at a higher level. So given the current limits of the program in terms of how available the tax credits are, we would like to see an expanded program to get numerous CO2 capture projects up and running and to supply CO2 from a number of industries for use in EOR. So first and foremost, our NEORI tax credit proposal, it would target the cost gap. And let me tell you a little bit more about the cost gap. The cost gap is the difference between the cost to capture and transport CO2 and an EOR company's willingness to pay for CO2. So as you know, like you can sell CO2 for a certain dollar amount for use in EOR, but there's a limit to the willingness an EOR company will pay for that CO2. So by targeting the cost gap and working with the existing market demand for CO2, our tax credit would only cover the cost to capture and transport that EOR does not pay for. Under NEORI's design, the tax credit would be offered in such a way in order to be revenue positive to the federal government within a 10-year window. This is because EOR production raises revenues from three main sources: corporate income taxes on EOR revenues, income taxes on private income from royalties from EOR production, and royalties from EOR production on federal land. So this slide shows a list of some of the additional provisions of our proposal. In addition to keeping 45Q as a production tax credit, the taxpayer can only claim the credit upon successful injection of CO2 in EOR. NEORI's proposal includes additional provisions to help it achieve certain objectives, mainly minimizing costs and driving innovation. First, to minimize costs, NEORI recommends that credits be allocated via competitive bidding or reverse auction. So how this would work, a CO2 capturer would bid for credits, and an allocation of tax credits would be awarded to the party with the lowest dollar per ton bid for tax credits. Any additional allocations of tax credits would be made based on the funding available for the program in any given year. Once awarded, a taxpayer will apply for certification for their tax credits. This provision will reserve the tax credits for a given project and ensure and enable the project to know that the credits are reserved in case they need to use them in any sort of application for financing. A taxpayer will only maintain certification for their tax credits provided they meet certain construction and operations timelines. So there's a limit to how long you can hold on to them. NEORI also recommends that tax credits be allocated through separate tranches based on CO2 source and cost. And I'll show you that in the next slide. In the recent months, we've also added another provision to adjust the annual value of tax credits based on changes in the price of oil. This will protect taxpayers when oil revenues fall, and while also protecting government from overexposure when oil prices rise. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So here is the tranche structure that NEORI recommends. A tranche is basically a separate pool of credits, and they would be lineated by the source of CO2 and the cost of CO2 capture. So as you can see, we have a pioneer tranche for first-of-a-kind projects where you expect to find projects with the highest capture costs. For the non-pioneer tranches, there would be a separate power and industrial tranche. This industrial tranche would be further subdivided between low-cost and high-cost CO2 sources. And on the next slide, I'll show you why we have these tranches. So as you can see, the estimated cost of CO2 capture and transportation can vary pretty significantly among CO2 sources. CO2 capture for certain industrial sources, natural gas processing, ammonia production, you can see them on the right-hand side of the slide, are much lower than the cost of capture for power plants and other industrial sources, and power, steel, and cement production. NEORI believes that it's essential to get these lower cost industrial sources involving these lower capture sources up and running. They offer a near-term opportunity to supply CO2 for use in EOR. The revenues from these early projects can help generate revenue that'll cover the cost of incentives for more expensive projects. They'll likely come on later. And going back to this is the previous slide adjusted to show that the power sector is really the biggest potential source of CO2 for EOR, but unfortunately it's also the most expensive. If all the CO2 capture projects were competing for credits without tranches, you wouldn't necessarily see a power CCS project beat an industrial project based on cost. So that's why NEORI strongly recommends the use of tranches to get capture projects in all sectors of the economy up and running. Here's just a slide that shows how our proposed incentive would work. You have the capture costs, you have how much an EOR company is willing to pay, and then the final column you have the cost gap. So this is how much an incentive would be needed for each kind of capture source and project. NEORI did an analysis to see if the recommended incentives would become revenue positive in a 10-year window. As you can see on the next slide, I'll show you, our analysis shows that CO2 EOR production is likely to be revenue positive within a 10-year window and very revenue positive over time. So as you can see on this slide, there's an initial cost for the incentives as you award them, but over time, the revenue from EOR production greatly exceeds the cost of these tax credits, and over time, they provide much more revenue than the initial cost of incentives. As I mentioned earlier, NEORI also recently adopted a mechanism to adjust the cost or the value of tax credits based on changes in the price of oil. We thought this was particularly important to help with the scoring of our potential legislation, and also because it's likely that oil prices will rise over time. Basically, under this mechanism, when oil prices rise, the value of the tax credit will fall. This reduces the amount of federal support when market conditions are favorable. When oil prices fall, the value of this tax credit rises. This helps to ensure that a CO2 capture project won't be left shortchanged by a decline in the sales revenue they receive for selling CO2 for EOR. This slide just kind of shows how the tax credit would work under various scenarios. You know, a capture project would have a given cost, it would also have a certain fixed percentage that receives for its CO2, and based on the price of oil, this the value of the tax credit, which you can see either in green or red, would change. So in some years you'll have a higher tax credit when oil prices are lower. In contrast, you'll have a lower tax credit, or maybe not even a tax credit at all, in years with higher oil prices. Also, NEORI recommends a variety of state-level policies to support either CO2 capture or EOR production. There's a variety of policies, and we recommend other states consider these as they're trying to develop policies to promote either industry. So this is basically the end of my presentation. We hope that the 113th Congress considers 45Q expansion in the context of tax reform, and we hope this debate is coming up soon in Congress. We hope that states will consider our state-level policies, and we just ask anyone who hears our story to help us tell it. We think CO2 EOR has a lot of benefits for energy security, the economy, and the environment. So with that, I think I'm done, and I'll hand it over to Ben.
Thank you, Patrick, for a very informative presentation. I'd like to remind the audience you can type your questions into the question block during the presentations. Our next presenter is Ben Yamagata from the Coal Utilization Research Council, and Ben will be discussing the ideas that have been formulated by CURC. Ben, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
The Global CCS Institute. And Patrick, thank you. I think to the audience that's listening, I will probably go over many of the slides that I have, which are not that many, but fairly quickly, because I think Patrick has hopefully made the case to all of you on why using CO2 for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery seems like a very good idea to us as well, and I don't think I need to cover a lot of the rationale or the potential revenue back to the U.S. federal government as a consequence of the mechanism both the NEORI group and CURC are proposing. What I thought I would do, however, is for you is to, let's see, how do I do this? Here I've got it. Is to first of all let you know a little bit about CURC, and what you should have on your screen at the moment is a list of our membership. I think the important point to be made here is that we're a U.S.-based organization primarily, comprised of very large coal producers located in the United States, again primarily, along with very significant utility power entities who utilize a great deal of coal in their energy production base. We also have a significant number of manufacturers, equipment suppliers, and technology developers, along with a number of different types of associations and that represent both the coal industry as well as the electric utility industry. And then, too, as you can see on the slide, a number of research organizations, including a number of universities and state-related coal-based organizations as well. Our purpose as an organization is to advocate for the development, research development, demonstration, and deployment of clean coal technologies, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. Let me start by noting, I guess, a couple of differences that I think will become evident as I get into this discussion a bit with the very fine points that Patrick has already made. First of all and foremost, we are a coal-based organization. That's what we're interested in. That's what we are trying to promote. And as a consequence of that, I think what you'll see fairly quickly is that the EOR program, through the utilization of CO2 that the Coal Utilization Organization is promoting, is focused centrally upon the use of coal, the capture of CO2 from coal-based facilities. I have up on the slide what we believe are the realities of the current circumstance, at least in the United States, driven a lot by inexpensive and plentiful natural gas, as well as I think some of you know, pending and already proposed environmental regulations, which are having an impact on the use of coal. And finally, as I think some of you may already know, efforts to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide. That said, in the context of, again, an organization that is focused on coal, let me say that as an organization, we have a policy position that says essentially we do not foresee the development of new coal-based power generation facilities without also addressing the issue of carbon dioxide. And it's within that context that if we look at where we think the world is going to be with respect to addressing CO2, either through not emitting any CO2 at all or otherwise controlling or being cleaner than what a coal unit today might be, the slide that you see in front of you is an estimate taken from the Energy and Information Administration's 2013 annual energy report, projecting the costs of various sources of electric power, both with and without carbon capture and sequestration technology. The important items, I think, for our purposes are with respect to pulverized coal units with and without carbon capture, and I think you can notice the difference in projected levelized cost of electricity, both with respect to pulverized coal systems, but also with respect to gasification platforms as compared to natural gas, nuclear, and a form of renewables. So that's the competition that we believe we're up against. And it's in the context of that, and as a coal-based organization, that we've developed not just an EOR program, but what we believe is a program for coal based on the development and application of technologies. And in that context, I'll quickly note what the elements of that, what we call a three-part program are, and then focus on the EOR part of that program. But let me start by saying that we believe that there is a need to develop technologies. We have, with the Electric Power Research Institute, drafted last August of 2012, a fairly robust technology roadmap that attempts to address both carbon capture, but also price reductions in capture, and as importantly, a resulting cost of power, even while using those capture systems. So we've developed what I call a long-term technology roadmap that addresses technology issues, again, as I say, related to capture. Let me skip over the midterm program because that's what I want to focus on, and just point out that we've also are looking at how do we maintain through the utilization of technology or the development of technology the existing fleet in the U.S., which those of you who are listening from the U.S. know that the existing coal fleet in this country is the provider of a great deal of reliable and low-cost electricity. And so we're looking at a near-term program that can ensure the continued viability and operation of the existing coal fleet. That said, what I wanted to do was spend a bit of time talking with you about the midterm program that we have developed. This includes both a program very similar to what Patrick has described that the NEORI has developed and proposed, and we can talk, I think, primarily about some of the differences between those two proposals. Let me say, by the way, that in that is CURC's discussion with NEORI and with our own CURC members and others, I believe we've made it very clear that we intend as CURC, and I think that's the same case with NEORI, to come up with eventually a program that we can all join hands on, and I think we're very close to that anyway, as you'll see. We're yet to develop all of the pieces of this three-point program, and as an organization, as a CURC organization, our first and primary initiative is to try and convince policymakers to take a broad look at all pieces of that package before we try and focus on any one piece. That said about the EOR program. The other program is with respect to trying to encourage simply the construction of ultra-supercritical pulverized coal systems that will eventually be required to utilize carbon capture systems when they are commercially available. Let me just briefly describe the latter program that I just referenced, and that is a 10 gigawatt ultra-supercritical program that would really be focused on trying to provide non-dollar incentives for entities to consider the construction of advanced pulverized coal systems. Those systems, as you can see from the chart, would be oriented towards and qualified, in order to qualify for the program, would have to be able to ensure the utilization of advanced technologies, both in terms of performance of the power generation system itself, but also with respect to modern emission control systems. We believe that it is important during a period of time in this country when there are projections that there will be no new coal-based power generation facilities constructed for a variety of reasons, that we ought to encourage at least the consideration of trying to construct these types of advanced systems and to provide some types of non-financial incentives that might encourage potential users to at least seriously look at pulverized coal, advanced systems, utilize and advanced emission controls, and do it in a time period when at least the projections are currently indicating that we wouldn't be doing any type of new coal builds in the next 2.5 or 3 decades. As I said before, this program, which is be limited to 10 gigawatts in total, would also encourage and require the application of carbon capture systems when those systems are judged to be commercially available. Let me spend a couple of minutes then talking about the other piece of the midterm program. And as I said, I thought that Patrick did an excellent job of describing both EOR and the use of carbon dioxide as a tertiary recovery system, so I won't go into that. I would like to note, as I said at the outset, that the program that we have designed is focused specifically on coal-based systems, appreciating the fact that the NEORI program is looking at a number of different sources, potential sources of anthropogenic CO2. Again, ours is only related to coal. also point out, as Patrick noted, that it's in the power generation sector where we all expect to see the largest supplies of anthropogenic CO2. Our focus then is on how do we get the power sector, particularly the coal-using sector, to capture CO2 and use it for the EOR purposes. And in the same vein as the NEORI example, we would see trying to pay for or offset the cost of what is really otherwise a subsidy to the capture of the CO2 through taxes and royalties that already exist. And I want to emphasize that point, and that is that we are not advocating the establishment of new taxes. We are simply saying that with respect to those taxes that the EOR producer or whoever is the final beneficiary of drawing out the crude oil would have to pay otherwise under existing law, those federal receipts and royalties would be used for a subsidy for the carbon capture itself. I'll spend a couple of minutes on this slide, mostly for the purposes of running you through what I think are the principal elements, the key features of the CURC-oriented accelerated CO2 EOR program. We believe that the program should be limited in duration, that is for about 10 years, and that it should be limited in scope and size to no more than 5 to 10 gigawatts of coal-based facilities. Some would even argue that we don't need that much power production potential itself, but at least for our purposes and at the moment, we're talking about a program of that size. I think the important thing here, though, is that it's coal-based and that it's limited in size and limited in duration. We believe, as Patrick has also pointed out, that the revenues that over time that are acquired through the oil recovered can actually help to finance both this program and portions of the other programs that I briefly outlined in the 10-part or the 3-part program that I described at the outset. I already mentioned that it's oriented towards new and existing coal plants only, and I would mention also that at least from our modeling, the projects would receive assistance for no more than 15 years. Why is that? Because after that point in time, at least again as our modeling tends to show, we wouldn't be looking at any deficits, at least from the standpoint of the capture system itself and the operator owner of the capture system. We would also want to make clear, as we have in our discussion papers, that we would start by noting that injection wells used for CO2 purposes would be classified as Class 2. We need to take another look at that in light of the activities that EPA is already has underway with respect to classification of wells. But for purposes of clarity, we would start by saying that injection wells under the program we are proposing would be classified as Class 2 wells. Finally, just a couple of notes that are, again, to note some differences with the NEORI approach. I believe Patrick mentioned that their program is oriented towards covering the cost gap or cost delta between what is potentially the market price that would be paid for a ton of CO2 and the cost of capture. We looked at that slightly differently. We see the need, given the risk profile for capture systems, at least at this early stage, to also identify what would be a reasonable rate of return for that investment. So our program is not oriented towards trying to cover a cost delta difference. It's oriented towards keen to a return on investment that the risk taker would find acceptable in order to undertake the project. So, if you will, the fundamental premise here is the cost that you could achieve or receive in the market for a ton of CO2 versus the cost that a capture would require, which would include a return on investment and obviously include the cost of capture itself. The second point that I would note is that, which I guess is obvious at this point, is because we are coal-based only, we wouldn't be looking at various tranches and various sources of anthropogenic CO2. This slide, which I think is very similar to something that Patrick put in his slide deck, indicates the possibilities of what an EOR program might produce through the use of primarily anthropogenic CO2. One last thing that I would like to quickly cover, and I believe Patrick also brought this up in the context of an alternative subsidy that they have in mind as well, with respect to how would you determine the value of the subsidy itself. And what these last three slides in this presentation attempts to cover is the rationale behind what we call a variable subsidy. I want to emphasize that while our organization and the members of CURC have looked at the whole notion of CO2 EOR for a good many years, actually, at this point, the variable subsidy idea is still an idea that we have not passed through the entire CURC membership, and so my discussion of it is simply to inform you that this is an approach that we have under consideration. It is an approach, I think, that Patrick would agree is very similar, if not identical, to the one that Patrick described. But let me give you some further thoughts, at least on our part, as to why this is an interesting approach that we've come up with. It clearly, as I think all of you on the phone probably already know, is CO2 prices in the market, from what we can tell, are linked contractually to oil prices in an effort to get away from the idea of a simple fixed subsidy, particularly if we're working in a political environment that sees the volatility of oil prices, and that's what a ton of CO2 would be key to. The volatility of that oil prices could, under certain circumstances, with a fixed subsidy or even a fixed tax credit, if you will, be highly valuable. In fact, over-reward, if we can use that word, the capture as a taxpayer, simply because the value of oil would be so high that the ton of CO2 could be significantly higher that they receive in the market, and yet they would be getting a fixed subsidy. So that was the attempt, that was the circumstance that we are actually trying to address. And I think, as Patrick pointed out, it's an attempt to recognize the variability in price of oil. In effect, what the applicant would do, and this again is the capture of the CO2, is to look at two elements and simply bid them. So it's a competitive bidding process. One is on what we call a strike price, and that is what the project developer or the owner-operator would have to get in order to make an adequate return on investment, and subsumed in that is to cover the investment, which is not otherwise covered by the price of price on a ton of CO2 that entity could have gotten in the market. That same entity would bid a second point in the bid process, and that is a rate. And at least in our examination of what that might entail, at least our conclusions have been that anywhere between 2 and 3% of the price of oil is what one might expect as a rate for what the market would pay for a ton of CO2. Keep in mind that both what we're calling the strike price and the rate, however, are bid by the entity or the applicant that's seeking this subsidy, and therefore it could be something very different than that, than the 2 or 3%, and it's totally contingent on what that individual project developer has in mind, even though it remains an unknown within the market. It's easy enough to note, I think, that this type of program would account for we think, the volatility of oil prices itself. It may insulate from at least the perception that the taxpayer is subsidizing and overly subsidizing the project developer. That said, as I said at the outset, I believe, as CURC, that we will join arms with NEORI. As you can see from my description and from Patrick's, the programs are very much almost the same, with some differences that clearly can be worked out. And in the end, that's what we will do. So the encouragement to everyone on the phone and the understanding for all on the phone out to be that we'll be working this program together. CURC's intention at the moment is to have people look at a coal-only program and also the other elements of the three-part program I described. But our expectation is that in the end, we'll all be pushing in the same direction for the enactment, which is what it will take, some type of federal legislation in order to effectuate this CO2 EOR program. I want to thank you for your time. Look forward to discussion, Tom and Patrick. There is our contact information, and happy to provide you all with further information. I might also add, I believe, Tom, in the slide deck I provided to you, there are some examples of how the variable subsidy would work for those participants on the phone who want to understand the description of how the program would work more specifically than what I described. But with that, I'll thank you very much and look forward to your questions.
Ben, thank you as well for that very informative presentation. We do have some questions. With the last 8 or 10 minutes we have, I'll get right to them. First question: can you speak to the increased value of CCUS with President Obama's speech today calling for drastic reductions in emissions of CO2 from existing coal plants, and thus the necessity of commercial scale retrofit capture and storage CCUS? Patrick, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say that, CCUS is basically what our proposal is. We want an incentive for carbon capture for use in EOR. The President's announcement today sets a standard for emissions that probably means that you need capture to be integrated with power projects in the future. But that emission standard alone probably won't get you to the completion of a project. An incentive is needed to overcome the initial high costs of capture and transportation for CO2.
Ben,
is there anything you'd like to add? Any comments?
Well, thank you, Tom. And let me say that as it relates to the to the President's comments today, certainly expected, at least in one form or another. I would say that, as CURC has pointed out in comments we made to the initial proposed regulations from EPA, that 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour, which is fundamentally, as probably many of you know, equivalent to what a good combined cycle natural gas system might otherwise emit, coal can't do so today without the installation of some type of carbon capture system, which, of course, as I pointed out, is not attainable because we haven't done it on a commercial scale. That's point number one. What I'd hoped we would hear from the administration and did not was a recognition that if we're going to do CCS, which, as I pointed out, is something that our membership believes is a necessity for new power plant installations in the future, we also have to look at some type of a program that recognizes that costs are too great today, that the technology is not yet ready. And to the extent that is the case, what would have been another hopeful message that we didn't hear today was a fairly aggressive program that would recognize the cost problems and provide support for establishing some type of an incentive system that would allow coal to use carbon capture and to develop carbon capture technologies in these early stages. So while we recognize and certainly understand the President's position here, there is a significant amount of disappointment that we're not getting the needed support from the administration for the financial support that's required in order to make CO2 capture from coal-based systems a reality.
Thank you, Ben and Patrick. Another question for both of you. If the program, and this means both of your programs, become revenue positive to the government, why should it end if the incentives remain effective? Ben, why don't you go first on this one?
Thanks, Tom, and I think we agree with that. If I understood your question correctly, let me say that we have a program that is supposed to be limited in duration, that is the time, and also in the amount of, in this case, gigawatts covered. And the reason for that is that these programs and these technologies have to eventually stand on their own, and they have to do so without federal subsidy. I think we all recognize that some type of support is required in the initial stages, but there is a point in time when that's no longer the case. I think both Patrick and NEORI and CURC in our separate modeling have figured out that even for any given project, over a course of time, there should be dollars that are coming back to the government. In fact, our estimates are that if there's a 2 or 3% return on the government's investment, if you will, and that's of course better than nothing, and it's also better than no return at all. So we would say limited in duration of time, limited in the number of, in our case, the number of coal facilities to be assisted, and for the very reason I said, that is, it shouldn't go on for forever.
Patrick, any additional thoughts?
I would agree with Ben's points. I think NEORI would hope that our program would be revenue positive within 10 years. If it is revenue positive, it seems like there would be a case to continue the program, especially if you haven't necessarily seen the cost of CO2 capture decline to the point where the market can just support these projects by itself, and the technologies can stand on their own, as Ben described.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question and quick answers. CO2 for EOR could also be provided from combined cycle gas turbine plants with CCS. Should any kind of support therefore be available for coal and gas-fired power plants? 20-second answers. Ben?
20-second answers are that if we ever want to achieve goals in greenhouse gas mitigation along the lines of what has been talked about internationally, we're going to have to also capture CO2 from gas-fired facilities. So my answer is we need to do that as well.
Patrick?
I'll just add that NEORI's proposal is certainly open for CO2 capture from both coal-fired and natural gas power facilities. We hope that an incentive would come online to get facilities of both types online and capturing CO2 for use in EOR.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of the hour. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank Patrick and Ben for their excellent presentations, and Judi as well, who I know was involved in developing the C2ES presentation. We'd also like to thank the audience for your attendance and questions and participation today, and hope that you'll join us for future webinars. And with that, I'll say goodbye.